I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. This morning's interview is a bit unusual for Fear and Greed because for once we're going to blur the lines between fact and fiction in the world of business. My guest is a highly experienced, well-regarded business figure in this country. Siobhan McKenna is the Group Director Broadcasting for News Corp in Australia. She's also a Director of Woolworths and Nova Entertainment, among others, and is the current Chair of Foxtel, Fox Sports, and Australian News Channel, and the former Chair of NBNCo. Now, she can also add to the list a published author. And that's why we're blending fact and fiction, because Siobhan McKenna is here to talk about her debut novel, Man in Armour. Siobhan McKenna, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Why did you write a book? You were busy enough already.
I wrote a book because, I wrote a book because I love to write, and I've always been scribbling away, I guess. And then about 10 years ago, I realised that I could actually start writing about the business community. I could recharacterise my professional life as having been research for the purposes of my writing. And at that point, I decided I would attempt to write a novel that was set in the business community, which I knew so well. And it obviously took a very long time because I work and I also have 3 children. And I decided that I wouldn't publish it as a self-published novel. I'd only publish it if an actual publisher thought it was worthy. And so I was just really excited to find that HarperCollins did think it was good and that they wanted to publish it.
Congratulations. I mean, it's fantastic. I was reading an interview with you and you talked about, you almost got to the point when you were writing it, you liked the idea of your plane being late when you were travelling between cities because it gave you half an hour or an hour to squirrel away and keep writing.
Yes, that's right. Look, I'm generally a very organised person, but with what is essentially, or has been, a hobby for 20 years, but particularly intense hobby for the last 10 years, I guess I just had to snatch every minute I could, and I never set aside time explicitly in my diary to write. I just had to find whatever moments I could. And that meant that I always travelled around with a chapter in my handbag to whip out and start working on as soon as I got a moment.
Fantastic. And look, Man in Armour, it tells the story of Charles, an investment banker in London, who's more or less paying the price of his success. The business world's obviously something you're very familiar with. Is Charles someone who's an amalgam of the different people you've met along the way?
I had been writing what I guess would be sort of character studies during my 20s and 30s. And so I had a collection of people living out their lives in the bottom drawer in my study. And when I decided to attempt a novel, I dusted off all those character studies and refound Charles. And the 3rd chapter of my novel was actually where that vignette was. And I looked at him, and he's a successful investment banker. But in my character study, he was cold and unhappy and suffering from, I guess, what we'd call a contemporary dose of ennui. And I wanted to know how he had got to this cold office where his unhappiness and despair was so profound, and then how he would get himself out of that state. And that formed the basis of my novel, which is set over the course of 48 hours. But during that period, Charles faces a number of issues that have been a long time coming and tries to work towards a resolution.
Stay with me, Siobhan. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Siobhan McKenna, Australian business figure and author of Man in Armour. As you say, it's set over 48 hours and it's got lots of, money, sex, power, dominant themes throughout it. The pace of the novel is very quick and lots happen in that 48 hours. How accurate or authentic do you think it is of the real world?
Well, I did aspire very much to write the world building aspects of my novel in an authentic way. I read an interview with Hilary Mantel when she won the book prize for Wolf Hall, and that's more than a decade ago now. And I remember the lightning bolt for me was when she spoke to this interviewer and said, well, it took me 5 years to research Tudor England so that I could write Wolf Hall, which is set in that period, because she didn't know anything about the period. Prior to that, she'd written about the French Revolutionary period. And she described the process that she went through to learn enough about the Tudor period to have Wolf Hall resonate and be authentic for the reader. And I suddenly realised that I could do that. I could successfully set a novel in the business community because I was so familiar with it. And so my aspiration became to write a novel that would read as authentic and would be recognisable to people from that community, but that would still be accessible to people who are not in the business community. And I have to say, I felt a great degree of personal satisfaction when one of my dear friends, I was chatting to her by Zoom 6 months ago, and her husband happened to pass through the room, and he was previously a partner at KKR, one of the original they're the original barbarians at the gate, private equity. And he passed through the room and he saw me on Zoom and came rushing over and he said, Siobhan, I've read your book and I just have to say, I love it. I love the story, but I have to tell you, it was right. It was correct. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, it's not like Billions or all those other things that are set in the business community that are riddled with errors. Like, your book was correct. There was nothing in it that wasn't right. And
What a compliment.
that gave me, yes, it was. And I felt so happy about that because certainly the setting and the world building, I was aiming to be authentic.
Has anyone come up to you and said that character is a little too familiar?
Plenty of people. And, I can understand that because I have worked with a lot of different people, not only in Australia, but overseas, and done that over an extended period of time. And a lot of people that read it who are in the business community do recognise aspects of themselves.
Identify just a little too much?
Yes, quite a number of people have contacted me and wanted to talk about it because their experience of reading it was self-revelatory, which of course I was pleased and thrilled by. And a number of partners of people whose wives or husband work in the business community have spoken to me and said, wow, I think I understand my spouse better now. I didn't realise it was quite like this.
Well, I mean, I think one of the benefits, and again, you have mentioned this previously, is that as a business person writing a business novel, that's a little bit unusual. Lawyers write crime stories, but not many business people write corporate stories.
No, I think that's right. And I guess I have to hope that that's my comparative advantage. I think that there's a good tradition of ex-spies writing spy novels.
Yeah.
And people appreciate that gives those spy novels an air of authenticity. And as you say, lawyers will sometimes write crime novels. But perhaps there just hasn't been a long history of business people writing novels set in the business world.
What I find interesting is that you're relatively private person, given the positions you hold at News Corp and Woolworths and previously at NBN, yet putting a novel out there really is putting yourself out there because while it's not autobiographical, obviously it's things you've thought about or experienced, that type of thing. How tough was that?
Look, I think quite challenging and quite difficult, but I went through a process of thinking whether I should publish under a pseudonym so that people didn't know it was me. I thought about not publishing at all and just having it as something that I had done for my own pleasure. But I guess I wanted to take it to a publisher to get a view on whether it was of a high enough standard to be published. And, I do respect and admire authors so much. I love to read. I read a lot.
A book a week, is that right?
Yes, at least. I really do love to read, and I belong to 2 book clubs and enjoy that very much.
This is along with being a director and a mother of 3 and all that sort of stuff too.
Yes, I guess that's right. But, even though it is very personal and it was very confronting in the lead up to publication. I have to say I was very nervous. No, I hadn't really told anyone that I was writing because I never really thought I would be published, I think. Even once HarperCollins had said that they wanted to publish, didn't really quite believe it and kept thinking, oh, they can change their mind. And even once they'd sent me a contract, I'd signed it and they'd paid me in advance, I still thought, they could still walk away. It's just a sunk cost. And even after they announced that they'd acquired it, I was still like, they don't, the embarrassment will be to me, not to them, if they don't end up publishing it. It wasn't until I had the book actually in my hand, I thought, oh, okay, this is really happening.
Wow.
And I had to call my mother the day before HarperCollins announced back in, I think it was February pre-COVID, that they had acquired my book. And I called her and I had to tell her that I had written a book and that it was being published. And I just remember thinking, how do I bring this up? How do I explain that this has been my secret hobby for 10 years? And I had to do the same with my 2 book groups who obviously know me over a very long period of time and know how much I love reading.
And you hadn't told them that you were writing a book?
No, I didn't. And I remember saying, obviously it was pre-COVID and we were at someone's house in February, and I said, oh, look, actually, just before everyone goes, can I just mention one small thing?
There's a fundamental difference between you and the rest of the world. I would have been shouting it from the rooftops.
Well, I guess I never think the show is over until that old expression, the fat lady sings.
Yeah. So what's the next book?
Well, I have been working on something that's set in America this time, and that is set during the late 90s and early 2000s, relating to Silicon Valley and the dot-com boom. So I'm currently walking around with chapters of that in my handbag, although not walking around because, of course, I'm in Melbourne during COVID. So
actually, one of the things, Caroline Overington, who's a great writer and works at News, and I remember having this great conversation with her. She went from writing non-fiction to fiction, and she said the real release in writing fiction is you can actually make up conversations, whereas in non-fiction you can't make them up. And I always thought that was quite a creative outlet to be actually making up conversations.
Yes, look, I think so too. And I do like the conversational aspects of writing. I feel like I know my characters really very well by the time I'm writing about them. And in lots of ways, I don't know, they chat to each other and I write down what they're saying and try and capture it as quickly as I possibly can.
We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is business figure and author Siobhan McKenna. You mentioned you were in Melbourne. How's the lockdown been? How tough's it been?
I'm very lucky. I have a husband and 3 teenage sons living at home. So there's been 5 of us at home for the last 9 months.
Not everyone would say that's lucky, for the record. 3 teenage sons at home.
Well, far luckier than being home alone.
That's true.
Which I think would have been extraordinarily difficult. And I have to say, for me, I fly somewhere at least once a week for 20 or 30 years and have been away from a home, which obviously it's great to achieve business outcomes and travel for work, but at the same time, my heart's breaking while that's happening because I'm away. So having the 5 of us at home every single night, no one was at late fencing practice, no one was at play rehearsal, and I was never away. So in lots of ways, I was very lucky. But of course, COVID has just been extraordinarily difficult for business and for so many people.
Before you go, and on that point, what's your take on the state of the media industry in Australia at the moment? Obviously, the pandemic's hurt revenue side of things, but audience demand is still strong. Pretty challenging time for media companies.
Look, I think it's been a challenging time for media businesses for at least 20 years, probably longer. And that's because so much of media has been advertising funded and that model has changed. But I think what this COVID period has presented is an opportunity for content owners or content distributors to remind audiences how important creative content is to them, whether that's film or music or books or a television show. And so while it's been very difficult to manage through this crisis from a financial perspective, at the same time, my sense is that consumers of creative content have a new or a refreshed reminder of how important it is to them.
Which hopefully in the longer term will shine through and those revenues will return around.
Indeed.
Siobhan, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
No, thank you so much for having me on. I think the title of your podcast series, Fear and Greed, is extraordinarily apt.
Thank you. That's Siobhan McKenna, Group Director of Broadcasting for News Corp Australia and published author.